Perhaps instead of the question of change versus traditional, we should be asking is, what is essential? What no longer serves us? What needs to evolve?
All right, my friends, I am so stoked for this conversation because this is a guest for those who are watching on YouTube. And if you hear the voice, it's very distinct. And this guest was on years ago, which is amazing. I can't believe it. And I'm super excited because Adriano Di Prato is back with us. And he's brilliant, a brilliant leader across the pond. And coming from, I'm assuming, Australia still. Mm-hmm. Is that correct, sir?
Melbourne, Australia, yeah.
So we're on totally different time zones. He's eating lunch. I'm putting my kids to bed, but we're making it happen. And can't wait to hear the updates of your new role in education and just how you've been, my friend.
Well, Josh, thank you very much for the invitation and to be present again with you. I very much enjoyed our last conversation that we had a number of years ago, and we find ourselves here again. So since the last time we spoke, well, I've stepped into a new role as a campus director at LCI Melbourne. And for those unfamiliar with that name, LCI Melbourne is an institute of higher education that specialises in art, design and entrepreneurship. We champions of a phrase or an approach called different by design. And there's no one in Australia doing university level learning, or in your context, college, the way in which we deliver it. That's why we've called it different by design, where we put creativity, purpose, and industry engagement at the heart of all of our learning. Our focus is on ultimately preparing students for their future of work, particularly in what I call a no-collar economy, where adaptability, creative problem solving, and human-centered skills are the fundamental essentials for them to thrive. We do that, I'll say, by embedding an approach that we call a pedagogy of encounter, which is all about deep learning through meaningful connections of self, of place, and of the other. It's about shifting the from a transactional educational model to one that is totally transformational. And that's always been our focus here at LCI Melbourne. So whether it's AI, automation, or creative industries, we're ensuring that our students, our tertiary age students, don't just survive the changes that are ahead, they actually lead those changes.
Oh, okay, so this sounds like a perfect role for you. Just as far as knowing you and your background, what drew you to this new space and this new role?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I've been reflecting upon that in the last couple of weeks because someone did ask me that recently. You know, I was a career educator and a deputy head of a leading independent Catholic boys' school here in Melbourne for many, many years. And I was in that secondary school space for close to 25, 26 years. And, you know, established myself within that space. But over a period of time, and I might have alluded it to in our initial conversation, I increasingly became disenfranchised with an industrial model of learning and education. And although it continues to serve many young people very well, I don't believe it is the model that is going to serve the students within that context or even beyond going forward in the next stage of the 21st century. So I got a phone call in 2022 from an executive search company who said to me, Adriano, what are you doing right now? And I said, well, I've got my own podcast called Game Changers. I said, I've just finished, writing a best-selling book called Game Changers, Leading Today's Learning for Tomorrow's World. That's 2 shameless plugs there, by the way, Josh. And then on top of that, I had started up my own consultancy called A School for Tomorrow in partnership with my co-host on the podcast, Dr. Phil Cummins. And I got this phone call and they said to me, there's this new campus in Australia called LCI Melbourne. It happens to be one of 23 campuses around the world. It has a pedigree predominantly in Canada with a 65-year history in Montreal as LaSalle College in Montreal, and then there's LaSalle College Vancouver. And then there are campuses everywhere. There's Barcelona, Istanbul, Costa Rica, Colombia, Mexico, Indonesia, Morocco. I'm clearly forgotten one of them, and they're going to probably hate me for that. Tunisia, of course. How can I forget my North African friends? So there's this global network. And again, I said, I've got to be honest, I'm not really sure who they are or what they do because I wasn't very familiar at the time with Canadian-led education. And they said, look, can you just go and have a chat with the then dean, which I thought was going to be a 30-minute conversation. It became 3.5 hours. And when I left that conversation, I got a phone call from the executive search company saying, why haven't you called me? Why haven't you told me about what's happening? I said, well, I just actually left the meeting now. And she said, well, they're really keen to progress you in an interview. So then I had a formal interview the following week with the executive vice president of LCI Education, Dr. Jason Dooling. At the end of that interview, I was heading off from here, where I am right now in Collingwood, the campus, to the Melbourne airport, because I had to fly to Adelaide, where I was giving a keynote address the next day. And an offer was made. And I'm one of those individuals, Josh, that can be quite instinctual. And I just said yes. And so I said yes to giving up the podcast, giving up my consultancy, and starting in an entire new industry. It is still education, which I would hope to think that I have some expertise in over a period of time, but it is in the higher education's realm. So it's kind of foreign for me on one level, and I'm probably foreign to people in the higher education sector. But very quickly, I learned a lot about higher education and what's possible. And what I shared with you at the top of this show about our different by design approach, and particularly centered around the constructs of self, place, and the other, is a very unique proposition for any tertiary education to be doing. It's very unusual. Normally, it's very binary ways of faculties. Things are set and off you go. But we have a dynamic 2-year structure, irrespective of which degree that we have on offer. Everything is delivered over 2 years. We pride ourselves on being affordable, accessible, and accelerated. And at the heart of what it is the total student experience. What we can do in our boutique university here in the creative hub of Melbourne called Collingwood, a suburb, is that we can scale relationship, we can scale industry engagement and real world applications of learning and knowledge at a level that some of our big public education competitors probably can't because of their size. And that's our key point of difference. Price point is a key point of difference. Our location is a key point of difference. I understand that in the United States right now, there's lots of conversations about DEI, but for us, diversity is an inherent strength. And Melbourne, for your listeners, will know that we are a leading capital of the world of the value of multiculturalism. And so irrespective of ethnicity, orientation, religion, age, gender, all those things, LCI Melbourne's doors are open to your possibility. And that's what our key focus is on.
Man, I love it. Do they need a Colorado chapter? That's my next question.
Perhaps you do. Yeah. But
Sounds brilliant.
I'm just concerned that as a Canadian company, your current president might put a tariff on this education. But that's a whole different conversation.
Well, as far as the inclusion piece, I love that your institution is open arms to everyone that wants to learn and is preparing them for life. And I think that's perfect for our next topic here, because you said shameless plugs. I'm going to say perfect plugs, because I want everyone to go check out this book, Game Changers, Leading Today's Learning for Tomorrow's World. And then also your wonderful podcast. I know it's still out there and still exists for people to consume. So definitely we'll have that in the show notes for everyone. That was not a shameless plug by any means, because I actually found you through those different pieces of literature and then also the podcast. But, you had talked about kind of the real world situation, preparing people for just the world that we're living in, which is ever changing. I just heard a podcast the other day with Seth Godin. It was a brilliant interview, and he was talking about education and just like the shifts that are occurring and kind of what you were frustrated with, as far as the model that is sometimes very archaic when society in general is changing at such a fast pace. And I'm just wondering, for our educational leaders that are listening right now, what can they do to kind of adapt their educational setting to prepare students for that rapid change?
I'll say this. First of all, Seth Godin is a hero of mine. Yeah. So I've always wanted to interview Seth, but right? That continues to elude perhaps both of us. If anyone does get a handle of many of his books, particularly Tribes, it's quite an awakening read. And what you just touched upon there about society changing at probably the fastest rate in history, and that's what you heard Seth talk about in podcasts that you listened to. Seth is absolutely right. Society is shifting at a pace that we have never seen before. It is unprecedented in our human history. Yet the reality is this: many schools are still operating with structures built for an industrial age. If we want to prepare students for an uncertain future, we must be rethinking everything, from assessment to the way in which we even structure the learning experience. So from my perspective, it comes down to three fundamental shifts. First, we need to shift from content delivery to capacity building. Knowledge is everywhere, and of course it has its place. But the ability to think critically, adapt, and to create is what will set students apart in today's world for tomorrow's future. That's the first. The second is we need to move from rigid pathways to flexible, personalized learning. Students need greater ownership of their learning journey with real-world experiences and industry engagement as a common thread. As I said before, knowledge has its place, skills has its place, but in our, say, for a university context, the third part of that trilogy is the application of that knowledge and skill. And that's where it becomes the personalized piece in relation to the real-world applications. The third is we've got to move from the position of fear to the position of possibility. Too often, education reacts to change instead of leading it. Leaders need to step up into the unknown with confidence, modeling courage so that we can continue to instill that type of attribute or those type of attributes within our students. Too often, us in education, particularly at the K to 12 sector, we're operating in a fear construct. It's a deficit thinking. We've got to shift that narrative. We've got to move to the construct of possibility. And ultimately, possibility is intrinsically linked to the construct of love and hope. And we have to continue to play in that space. And as educators, the moment we lose hope, I think we've got to pack up the doors and find another profession, right?
Oh my gosh. I think we're seeing that firsthand with so many people leaving the field of education. I think what you're saying is 100% correct, is that they're losing hope. And I want to go back to the book and your podcast, because, obviously the title, Game Changer, I can envision what that might look like for a school leader, but I would love for you just to define what that is based on the characteristics that our listeners should have if they want to consider themselves a game changer in their school community.
Of course. Now, I'm going to give them a very brief kind of summary of that, because
Please.
I would want them to depart with 60 Australian dollars, of course, to purchase the book so I can retire earlier. But, Phil and I had the great privilege over 2 or 3 years to interview over 250 individuals from across education, business, and social enterprise. And based on those individual conversations to an audience that ballooned out to 800,000 listeners a week, what we discovered there were 4 key character traits that were common amongst all of them. But before I get to it, I'll say this. A game changer leader in education doesn't just respond to change, they create it. And they often only make up less than 5% of the educators within that industry. They move beyond the incremental improvements and instead fundamentally shift the way in which we think about learning, the way we think about teaching, the way we think about working, and the way we think about leadership. In the book, Game Changers Leading Today's Tomorrow, we've identified 4 character traits that we believe define a game-changing leader. The first is curiosity. True leadership starts with a relentless hunger to learn. It's inherently part of who we are as humans, right? Game changers ask the deep questions. They challenge assumptions and they seek out new perspectives. They understand that growth, both personal and institutional, begins with inquiry. That's the first. The second character trait is compassion. Leadership is ultimately about people. People make place. We can never lose sight of that. Game changers lead with empathy, actively listening to their communities, ensuring that education remains human-centered. They create cultures of belonging where students and teachers alike feel seen, they feel valued, and they feel deeply supported. So far, curiosity, compassion. The fourth trait is courage. Transformation isn't easy. We all know that. It requires stepping into discomfort, making bold decisions, and sometimes standing alone in the face of an enormous amount of opposition. Game changers have the moral and professional courage to take risks, challenge the status quo, and they fight for what is fundamentally right. Curiosity, compassion, courage. And the fourth is conviction. True game changers are leaders who anchor themselves in purpose. They're intentional about that purpose. Game changers don't just lead for the sake of leadership. It's not about ego, it's about ecosystem. They are deeply committed to a vision of education that is future fit and transformative. They are deeply committed to an education that is ethical and understands its place for social responsibility. They persist through obstacles because they believe in something greater than themselves. So 4 key fundamental traits: curiosity, compassion, courage, conviction. These 4 traits, we believe, are the secret sauce of high impact educational leadership. They allow leaders to move beyond mere managers and instead foster deep, lasting change that prepares all learners, not just for the world as it is, but for the world they wish to create. I'm interested, Josh, though, how do perhaps some of these traits that I've just shared with you show up in your own leadership?
Well, and this kind of segues perfect to my next question, was just that balance of, I know what I need to do. And a lot of them were traditional practices versus I have this vision that I want to do all of these things. And what I love about what you're talking about is like the empathy and the compassion and things like that. I mean, you're 100% correct as far as like it's relationship based. It's about people. It's about learning what's going on in their world. And so many times when you think about leadership, unfortunately, it's more about like the managing side of things and the accountability and the tough conversations. But really, when it comes down to it, I'd much rather hone in on the 4 C's that you just talked about versus some of these traditional viewpoints or expectations that are put on our leaders in education as to what you should be versus what's going to work with just the human person.
Yeah. I think it's interesting what you just shared there in your response to my question. And that was, you used the word traditional because I feel that's a default for many of us. I don't want to demonize that word. I don't want to demonize that because I think the key is honoring the past without being trapped by it. I think that's the key. Yeah. Tradition gives us our roots, but if we hold too tightly, we limit its possibility. And for me, one way to navigate this balance is by reframing the conversation. Perhaps instead of the question of change versus traditional, we should be asking is, what is essential? What no longer serves us? What needs to evolve? For example, at LCI Melbourne, we deeply respect craft, technique, and discipline in the creative industries. We know for our fashion and design students, there are fundamental knowledge and skills about pattern making and garment construction. For our interior design students, there are fundamental knowledge and skills around floor plans and elevations and orthogonal projections and so on. But that's about respecting the craft. That's about respecting technique. That's about respecting the discipline within that creative industry. But we also need to push the boundaries with emerging technologies, with new modes of storytelling. That's about keeping us focused on what's meaningful and letting go of what's merely been a habit.
Yeah, you're giving me a lot to think about right now. All right. Sure. So let's go back to the fear beast because I love that term. And I think that is unfortunately something that drives a lot of our decision making, because you use the data saying, as far as game changers, that is probably about 5% of our leadership in education. I'm just thinking there's got to be a higher percentage of folks that are at least willing to think about the possibility of being a game changer on their campus or in their district. So what are some things that you could suggest for our listeners if they're looking to make some changes, to be innovative within their school community? What are some things that maybe they can do as a starting point, as a launching point?
I'm going to frame it this way for you, Josh, my response. I'm going to talk about, because so much of my work is about being intentionally purposeful.
Yeah.
And so I want to talk about I'm going to respond to you in saying, what are some of the most impactful strategies that we could share with your listeners, whether they're leaders or whether they're the average teacher in the classroom? And I don't mean to be dismissive when I say the average teacher in the classroom, because we know they're on the front line in many ways, and they are the ones who continue to give us the right impact. Yep. So I'll say this, a strong vision isn't about a beautifully worded statement. It's ultimately about an action. 3 things I've found crucial and critical to empowering people in the action piece. First of all, the first thing anyone can do is make the vision visible. If staff and students can't articulate that vision in their own words, it means it's not embedded. It must show up in daily conversations, not just in a strategic plan. So my first thing about trying to start that movement towards the transformative piece is you need vision, but to do it, you need vocabulary that becomes embedded within the culture. of the community that you're working with and that you're leading. The second is, and this is probably a lesson for the leaders, listen before leading. The best school visions and the best ways to make an impact come from a collective ownership, not a top-down mandate. What are the students saying? What does the industry need? What are staff noticing? What are the expectations of our parent community? Sometimes all those are different. How are we finding a consensus where we're leading with empathy, we're listening, but then we need to make decisions. So one is about a vision and a vocabulary. The second is a practice of being open to the possibility of the other and having them around the table to form the practice of moving forward together. But the third is you have to be committed to a continuous alignment. Education isn't static. Vision needs to evolve as the world shifts. Schools that are thriving today have leaders who embrace iteration, rather than waiting for the perfect plan to come along. It's never going to happen. Perfection is a false god, and we've got to stop bowing to the altar of perfection. It has no place within learning. Excellence, on the other hand, different concept, right? Because excellence is based on aspiration. Anyone that's listening to this, how can the leaders in the rank and file buy into the vision? How can they listen? And then how can they commit to this continuous alignment of wanting to be simply better than they were yesterday? You know, again, I'll give it in the context of LCI Melbourne. Our vision is lived out in a way we structure learning, real world projects, deep industry engagement, a commitment to creativity as a fundamental life skill, not just as a piece that's going to get you employed. You know, we talk about in our schools, Josh, amplifying the value of literacy and numeracy. We all know in the absence of those, we're going to struggle from a cognitive point of view, from a metacognition point of view. But my argument always is creativity should be put up in the same value as literacy and numeracy for today's world. Because yes, we want to be literate, we want to be numerate, but the creativity is the application of that literacy and numeracy on a scale that we haven't seen before. So that my fourth tip to anyone listening is be open to the value and the possibility of creativity being a fundamental life skill, not just a career pathway.
All right, I want to pull out two words from your book because I think these are important, which is courage and purpose. And I'd love to know, in regards to those two words, how they just play in leading a school toward a future-ready model of education.
Okay, thank you. I'll respond in this way. You know, you will face resistance. There's no doubt about it. You will have people who prefer comfort over courage. No doubt about it. But intentional leadership, grounded in purpose, gives you the resilience to keep moving. One of my favorite ideas is from Maya Angelou. She had a quote, and I'm paraphrasing here slightly. The quote is that fear and hope occupy the same space. Invite one to stay. Too many leaders operate from that construct of fear, of failure, of backlash, of the unknown. But intentional leaders recognize that purpose is their compass and that courage is the fuel for that purpose. When decisions are made with deep intentionality, when every action aligns with a clear, future-focused purpose, the courage to take risks flows naturally. Courage is not just about boldness, Josh. You know, it's about being deliberate. It's about making choices that align with a bigger vision, even when they're unpopular. It's about moving beyond reactive leadership and stepping into a proactive stance where transformation is not about an afterthought, but a daily practice. And this is, I suppose, a lesson for all the students that perhaps will listen to this as well, and the listeners could share it with their students. When they see leaders leaders making courageous, intentional choices, not just reacting to change, but actually shaping it, they learn to lead their own lives with the same conviction. They see that courage is not reckless, it is purposeful. That purpose is not passive, it demands action. And that the future is not something that we must passively inherit. It is something that they need to shape and power. I say this to students all the time. Don't wait for life to happen to you. Because in the end, the most future-ready schools, whether they are a primary school or a secondary school or a high school in the North American vernacular, or at a university or a college, the most future-ready schools are the ones that they don't just simply adapt to change, but they're the ones who intentionally create the change. They're the ones who are in that 5% mark that I was sharing with you earlier.
So beautiful. I love it. Okay, let's transition to the final question here, which I'd love to ask for all my leaders here that I've interviewed over the last 7 years, which is, for our aspiring and current leaders who are listening today, it's wonderful. And I hope that they are as inspired as I am after this conversation, but I would love for them to take that action item, right? To step out and to be a game changer. So for someone who's listening to enhance their leadership journey tomorrow or next week, what would you recommend for them to do?
The first thing I would recommend them to do is to embrace that the future is creative. So this is the concept of a no collar. We've heard of the traditional white collar versus blue collar divide. I'm saying that we abandon that. And I'm imploring leaders out there to abandon that and adopt the philosophy of no collar. Because it should never be an either or. Education and learning should not be a pie that we divide into the haves and have-nots. The beauty of the no collar is it's about a future where creativity is at the center of conversations. In fast-growing careers today, whether it's in digital content creation, AI design, or architecture, all are part of what we are calling the no-collar economy. These roles prioritize adaptability, creative problem-solving, and human-centered thinking. Yet, creativity still sits on the margins in many educational systems. So I'm imploring the educational leaders listening to this conversation to find a place of where creativity can be seen in the same primacy as I said a moment ago of literacy and numeracy, where they are open to the possibility that creativity and the creative pursuits are no longer an elective, but are a fundamental, essential life skill. That the future of work demands it, and as educators, we should be advocating for creativity to take its rightful place at the center of learning. Because if we want students to thrive in a world that is changing at a speed that we have never seen before, we must stop treating creativity as a luxury and start seeing it as the foundation of a future-ready education.
I don't know, man. I want to start clapping and say amen. I don't know. That's brilliant. And as a former art teacher and art major, that was my perspective. And the only reason as a struggling student I went to school was because of those spaces where I was able to share my creativity every single day without anyone telling me to stop doing it. So yeah, what you said is touched me at a different level. And I just appreciate you saying that.
And Josh, can I just quickly jump in here? Can I say that creativity is not just the domain of the arts, right?
Yeah.
Scientists, engineers, lawyers, accountants. As technology keeps impacting every profession across the world and transforming the way we think and see and work and live, every profession and then the education that's required to support it's your development towards that vocation needs to think about the role of creativity in the place of problem solving, in the place of critical thinking, in the place of adaptability. They're almost kind of the elements that make up the value of creativity. And you pair that with being literate and numerate. In my experience and what I've been able to witness in my entire educational journey now for over 30 plus years, is I see every student simply shine when they're given that autonomy to dream and wonder.
So true. All right, Adriano, I would love for folks to connect with you in any way. Obviously, I've been putting up this link here, this website for folks to tap into some additional resources for you. But if you're directing them anywhere, where would you like them to connect with you?
Well, they can definitely hop onto that website because there's a wonderful link tree. When they click on there, that will take them to my X account, Twitter.
Perfect.
It'll also take them to my Blue Sky account now, considering, I'm thinking of blue sky thinking here.
Yes, for sure.
We can go there. But definitely they can connect with me on LinkedIn as well under my name, Adriano Di Prato, would be absolutely fine.
Wonderful. So I'll make sure I have the website and then all of those social media links for folks in the show notes, also on YouTube. And yeah, with that, my friend, I'm just so appreciative of you. Like I said, every time I talk to you, I just get energized, inspired. You just have so much wisdom, and I just appreciate your time and for you just to update us on all the wonderful things that you're doing, but then also this just beautiful aspect of being a game changer for our educational leaders.
Josh, it's always a pleasure to connect with you, and I really appreciate your time and your continued interest in my work and the work of game changers across the globe.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at www.teachbetterpodcastnetwork.com. We'll see you on the next episode.